Okay, so let's create one last extension to get a handle on all three extension types that you can use in SharePoint Framework. And to do this, we're going to be working in our marketing leads list that we just created in the last lesson, where we have deployed our new rating column. We also have added a yes/no customer column to this particular list, and we're going to kind of use this as a test case as we build our very last extension. And let's jump back into Hyper, and we'll go ahead and create this solution. Let's create a directory called Mark Customer, and let's cd into that, and we'll go ahead and run the Yeoman Microsoft SharePoint generator. In here, we're going to accept the default solution name, SharePoint Online only, use the current folder, default deployment type. We will, of course, choose extension, and we're going to choose the last option here, which is list view command set. We're going to call our command set Mark Customer. We'll accept the default description, and it's going to go ahead and install all of our npm dependencies for us. Great, so let's open this up in Visual Studio Code and we'll have a look. And in this solution, as with all extensions, before we can actually start up our gulp serve process, we do need to go into config, open up serve.json, and provide a live URL where we will actually want to test this. So let's go ahead and copy this marketing leads list URL. We'll paste that into here, and you'll see it is registering some custom actions. It has some properties just like are supported with all extensions. And we have a second entry down here that I'll go ahead and delete. And with that, we can jump back into Hyper and we can run gulp serve. We will allow it to load debug scripts, and you'll see by default we have this Command 2 button at the top, and if you select a single item inside of this list, you have both Command 1 and Command 2. If you click on them, you get this, what I think is obnoxious alert that does absolutely nothing. So it says one item is selected in the list. That's great. I'm glad I know that. You also have Command 2 that says this command is always visible. So as always with your extensions, you just kind of get some boilerplate, but you can see what this list view command extension does. It actually extends the command bar on your lists and your libraries in your SharePoint pages. And this is a really, really cool opportunity if you have certain actions or certain events that need to occur on your list items that maybe you don't want users to have to handle manually. Maybe you want to be able to check an item and then click a button that goes and updates several fields on that particular item. And this is a really great use case to be able to do just that. So what we'll do is we'll jump into Visual Studio Code and let's make some changes to this Command 1 and Command 2 so that we can actually tweak the way this is going to work and create perhaps a more real-world scenario of what we'd actually like to do in this particular command. First of all, the commands themselves are defined in the source extensions, and there's our Mark Customer solution or command here, but we have a manifest file, just like we do with all our SharePoint Framework solutions. And you'll see this has a bunch of stuff in it, but if you scroll down, it has an items object. And the items object by default contains Command 1 and Command 2. And with each command, you can specify a title, a type, you can specify an icon image, which we'll come back to. But in this case, I actually just want to create a single command called Mark Customer. And we'll change this to the text of the title to just be customer. And anytime in your manifest file you see a title with an object and default, that typically means you can do translations here. So I can do FR and do like the French translation there, so you can deal with your localization. And of course, you also get the localized folder over here for any content that's actually output in the render of your extensions themselves. So you can always utilize those. But for now, we'll just rename this to Mark Customer. We'll change the title to Customer in English, and we'll go ahead and save this manifest file. And we've now defined only a single command that can occur in this extension. Now let's close that file. We'll jump back into the entry point, which is Mark Customer Command Set.ts. This is similar to all the other extensions we've been working with. You can have extension properties on here if you choose to utilize those. And then it exports this mark customer command set class that's extending base list view command set, which of course has an onInit method. As always, they are logging some stuff, which I'll delete, but you do have the this.context, which is on this extension of type list view command set context, but that has all your normal stuff on it that you would expect inside of your context object. As we scroll down, you have this on list view updated, which receives an event. And this is very handy to be able to do just what they're doing in this case, where maybe you want a command that's only available when a single item is selected, or vice versa. And what you can do is on this event, you get the selected rows, which is it's a row accessor, but it's kind of like an array. So you can read things on that, like does it have a length on it, for example. So you can see in this case, they're saying that command 1 that we previously have, we're going to set its visible property to only equal visible if the selected rows.length is equal to 1. So that's why command 1 only shows up when you have a single item selected. If I select a second item, that command 1 disappears and we can only see command 2, which is always visible by default. In this case, I do want to go ahead and make this particular command only visible when you have a single item. So we're going to change this to mark complete. We'll change this variable compare one command to mark complete command. And that's only going to be visible when you have a single item selected in this case. And then down here you have finally an onExecute method. So this is where you actually define what happens when you actually execute a command. And this is where they're showing those dialogues. They're using the extension properties, and they use a switch statement if you have multiple commands to decide what command you actually want to execute, because you have this event object, and the event object has both the selected rows as well as the item ID, which the item ID comes from your manifest. That's these items. So the ID in this case is going to be mark customer. So what we want to do is, let's delete this line up here. We'll say case mark customer, then do mark customer stuff right in here. So within this case statement, this is where we'll put our logic for what happens when you click on the mark customer command. Let's go ahead and delete command 2 because we removed that from our manifest, and by default it'll throw an error if it tries to execute a command. And very simply we could just say console.log hello whenever you mark customer, and we'll go ahead and try this out. Let me open the console down here. We'll hit refresh. I'll clear that console and we'll hit load debug scripts. And then once that's loaded, as always, our manifest changes are what I'll call sticky. So we still see command 1 and command 2. I think every time you make a change to your manifest, you should exit and then rerun your gulp serve process. I think that's the only way to get that to actually refresh. It must load that in whenever you first run that. Okay, so now that that is done, whenever we actually execute our customer command, it's actually going to log hello down here at the bottom. I'm not sure why it's still showing it when we only have a single items, when we have no items selected. Let's double check that that is actually, I said mark complete. It's actually called mark customer. That's kind of what we're doing. We're kind of marking complete. So let's change this, to mark customer command there, and then that should fix that issue. We'll give that a refresh. We'll load our debug scripts, and now you don't see the command by default, but if you select a single item, you get this customer button. You click on it, it's going to execute whatever we put into this switch statement down here. If you select more than one item, it's going to disappear. We can no longer run that command. Cool. So what we actually want to do with this command is I actually want to be able to check one of these list items, and when you click on this customer button, I want to go and I want to update the customer yes no column on that particular item without the user having to go into edit, click on this, and then click on save. So we kind of want a really quick and easy way to say, this lead is now a customer. And this is just a really simple example of how you would do this. But again, this is a really good use case if you want to make a lot of updates on a single list item or a document, and you have some kind of defined process where you say these fields change based on some action. This is a really great tool to reach for to be able to do that sort of thing. So let's see what that looks like. Let's jump over into our onExecute method. And what we need to do first of all is we need to get some information about the list item that is selected. So when we click on customer, we need to know which customer we're actually selected. And in here we can take our event, and the event has a selected rows array, which is actually it's a read-only array here. You can see it's a row accessor, but we can take those selected rows and we can run all the normal array map and for each, all those functions that you would normally use. So if I want to map over each one of those, we could take each row, and then within that row we could do something. Now in this case we've marked it as you can only do this on a single item, so I don't really need to map over all of the selected rows, but just in case we ever decided we want this to run on multiple rows, I generally in these commands, I like to go ahead and just pretend as if the selected rows is always going to be an array. It's a little bit safer, even if there's only a single item in the array. And now that we've done this, we can get some information about the row that was selected. So for example, if I want to get the ID, which is going to be a number field, I can say row dot, and it has some accessors here and some methods, but I can say get value by name. So maybe I want to get the ID of that particular row. So we now have that stored in this ID variable. The same thing with if I want to get the current customer value, you can say const is customer of type Boolean is going to be equal to row.get value by name once again. And in this case, we want to get the customer column. And you want to make sure you're using the internal column name on these. If for some reason you had a column that was called customer yes, no, and then you went back and renamed it to just customer, the internal name, if you go look at it, will probably be something like customer yes, no. So just make sure you're using the internal name whenever you use this. And as you hover over this, you actually see in the tooltip, it says it takes an internal name of type string. Now, unfortunately, whenever you get the value by name using a command in this case, it doesn't necessarily come back as a Boolean. So this is actually going to come back as yes or no, because that's the way it's displayed inside of the list. It actually says yes or no. So if we want to convert this to a Boolean, we would basically have to say, if this is equal to yes, then it's going to be true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. And this is get lead data. Great. So we know a little bit of information about our lead. Now we can actually use the context on this extension to make an update to this list whenever this command is executed. And that's going to be using this.context.SPHTB client, just like we did in our web part. We could go and write an abstraction class here, certainly if you're going to use this in more than one place. But let's just very simply get this working. We'll prove that it works, and then we can certainly make improvements later if we need to. In this case, we're going to do a post request because we actually want to make an update. And as always, this is going to take some sort of URL as well as a configuration object. So let's go ahead and put in the configuration object. That's going to be SPHTB client dot configurations.v1. And your post method actually takes a third argument, which is going to basically be your post data that you're sending to this endpoint that we're going to define in just a moment. So we'll come back to that post data. Let's go ahead and build out our endpoint URL in this case. And let's, first of all, we need to start from this.context.pagecontext.web.absolute URL. So we're always going to start this request from our current subsite's absolute URL. And then we're going to go to /_API/lists. We'll get a list by ID. And the good news here is if we do need to get the list ID, that's also available in the context of this extension. So for example, I could say this.context.pagecontext.list, and that's going to give me information about the list that we're currently on, and I can get the ID from there. So you get all kinds of useful information inside of your context for your extensions. And then once we have the list, we can say, okay, go get the items in that list, and then get by ID once again. So we want to get a specific item inside of this list. And in this case, the item we want to get is going to be the ID that we got right up here. So that's a really long endpoint URL, but basically what we're doing by making a post request is we're going to make an update to this particular item. And then down here in our body, or our properties that are options that we're going to set on this post method here, we need to provide what data is going to change. And that's going to look like a JSON object. So that's going to be a body property. And we can do a template string here. And with a JSON object, we're going to set the customer property on this list item to equal the opposite of is customer. So basically, when you click on this command, it's going to toggle this customer yes, no on and off every time you click on that command at the top. And in order to get an update to work in SharePoint's REST web services, you also need to set some headers. And the two that you need to set on a typical update are going to be X HTTP method, which you need to set to merge. So basically you're saying take this JSON body and merge it into the original list item. And you also need to provide an if match. So by default, it's not going to update any items unless you provide this if match, which in this case will make it very permissive. We'll just say star, meaning update any item that you find, because we know that we're getting an item by ID. What you could do is you could make a post request to just items, and you could say update all the list items, and that's why they have this if match thing, because you could say only when this criteria is met, but we're not doing that in this case. And we could do a .then down here and do something with the response, but in this case I'm just going to say let's just kind of cross our fingers and hope that this works. Whenever you click on the button, it's just going to fire off this post request, and we don't really care what happens with the response. In a real world scenario, you would probably want to provide an alert or something to let the user know that, hey, nothing actually happened whenever you sent this out, or it failed for whatever reason. But in this case, we'll just get it working, make sure everything is good, and let's go ahead and test this out by refreshing and loading those debug scripts. Okay, so let's select our first item, Contoso. We'll click on our custom. Well, first of all, let me open the network panel, and we'll filter this by item so we can actually see our request to make sure that succeeds. But we'll select this first item, click on customer. You'll see it actually went out and updated that, and then now our customer value is set to yes. And if we click on this again, it's going to go and update it once again. And after a moment, you'll see that refresh back to no, which is pretty cool. We could do this on any of these items to simply say, you are now a customer. Cool. So now that this is done, you'll notice that all of your command buttons in the toolbar up here have a nice little icon to the left there. Ours does not, so it's looking very bare and lonely at this point. So what we can do is in our manifest file over here, you can actually see you can provide an icon image URL. And typically with extensions, you can choose to host the front-end assets like images and CSS files either in the SP package file itself, so it'll actually be served from your app catalog, or you would choose to host it on a CDN, which is a little more complex, and I don't really want to get into that right now because the CDN stuff just, you have to run all these things in the command line, whatever. We're not going to do that. So what you can actually do, what I find is the easiest way to get an image in here, because typically it's just a very simple icon, like you see here, is I'll use what's called a base64 encoded image. And the tool I use to do this is just called b64.io. It's a good bookmark if you want to be able to do that. But basically you just drag and drop an image here, and they give you a string that you can drop in here instead of actually referencing a real image URL. And as long as the image isn't real complex, this is actually very performant because it's kind of like hard coding the image data right into the page. So in this example, I do actually have an image. You'll see here, there's a little check mark. And it's just a tiny little ping file. So I'll just drag and drop that into this. And you'll see it gives me this data URL, which I can actually just copy and it's only 0.5 kilobytes, so we know this is really small and performant, and we can just come in here and replace icon image URL with this data URL, which is actually the data of that ping image that we just dropped in there, but it's base 64 encoded, which means we can actually use this directly in our HTML. And once we save this, it is in the manifest file, so we'll probably have to close this down and rerun a gulp serve. You'll see here, let's load our debug scripts. Now when we select a single item, you actually get an icon on your command button, which looks great. Okay, and finally with deployment on your extensions where you're creating these commands, you will notice in the sidebar over here, just like other extensions, you have this assets folder that has your XML files in it. So depending on whether you're tenant deploying this or just deploying this on a site-by-site basis as an app, you can choose to customize the properties if you're going to have those on your extension and all that good stuff inside of these XML files, which are also referenced in your package solution.json. So you can see down here are those element manifests. And again, if you're not going to tenant deploy this, you could just delete the client-side instance XML and just use elements XML. But we're going to ignore that for now because we're just going to do the app deployment in elements.xml. Another thing to note is you have this registration ID. When you register this custom action, it's actually going to register it based on a list template type. And this isn't actually something that you're ever going to see inside of the interface. So a lot of people that haven't worked with SharePoint before in terms of provisioning XML files may not be familiar with it, but your lists in SharePoint do actually have a template, and there's a number associated with them to define what type of template it is. And I'll post a link to this in the video description down below, but here's the documentation that actually shows a custom list is type 100, a document library is 101, etc. And so depending on which type of list you want to customize, if you want to customize all lists, you can just do 100, or if you want to customize all document libraries, you can do 101. But then if you want to get more specific and say, I only want my custom commands to show up on a task list, for example, you could set the registration ID to 107 in that instance. And you can even create your own custom list types if you use that provisioning XML. You can actually create a whole new list type. So whenever you go to add an app, instead of just choosing a custom list or a context list or a calendar, you can have my custom list template, and it will have its own number associated with it if you've used the provisioning XML to do that. So you could even scope this down to one really specific list if you wanted to. In our case, we're just going to add this to all custom lists just so we can get this working. And we'll go ahead and jump into our terminal here in Hyper, and we'll run our gulp bundle in ship mode. And we're also going to run gulp package solution in ship mode. And once that's done, as always, you're going to get your solution folder in the SharePoint folder, and we have markcustomer.sppkg, which we can then reveal in Finder. There is our SP package file there. We can drag and drop that into our app catalog to deploy this. Oops. Like so. That's going to come up with our trust dialog. We need to click on the deploy button to indicate we do trust this solution, and it's now going to be deployed so that we can go into our site collection. I can go to add an app. You can also do that from site contents, and we can add our Mark Customer client-side solution app that we have created. I'm still getting load debug scripts, so I'm going to add the reset equals 1 onto the URL up here. And we'll just keep refreshing until we can see this Mark Customer client-side solution activate. Okay, so that's now activated. We can now go into any custom list that we have created, And even without running in the development or the debug mode, we can go to our marketing leads and we're going to get that customer action rate on our toolbar. That's going to immediately update the customer property there. Awesome. So I think this has been a pretty decent tour of the extension capabilities that you have in SharePoint Framework. I certainly hope that you agree, and you could certainly take this further. There's a lot of things you could do with extensions, especially when it comes to integrating outside web services like Microsoft Graph, like the artificial intelligence and cognitive services that you have available in Azure, and all of those great sort of ecosystem services that they have as part of the Microsoft Cloud. I encourage you to challenge yourself and to create an extension unguided that's going to do something totally different, because I truly think that that is the best way to learn.